You're listening to I Can't Have Children, Now What? From Tutum Global, hosted by Jobi Tyson. If you're seeking answers about infertility and childlessness, this is the podcast for you, using research and lived experiences to solve history's infertility medical mysteries, while courageously taking you behind closed doors to face the question mark for 1 in 5 women sharing the same dilemma. I can't have children. Now what?
From Tutum Global in Atlanta, this is I Can't Have Children, Now What? I'm your host, Jobi Tyson. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I can't wait to jump into today's topic. But before we get started, all of you out there listening, make sure you're downloading and subscribing to us on all podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and Spreaker. And don't forget to leave a review, rating, and share with friends to help spread the word. So before we get started, I want to say thank you to the listeners who reached out to me after our first 2 episodes and bonus episode. Your feedback was very, very encouraging. We started out with a few subscribers, and now we have listeners all around the world tuned into the podcast. So thank you so much. Okay, so today's episode is called Understanding, Grieving, and Healing Invisible Loss. So we're going to discuss grasping, healing, and coping with invisible loss. We live in a culture that encourages fixing things, so we desperately try to make the flaws and holes go away. But infertility has an invisibility to it that few other griefs do. When someone dies, people notice. But what if the loss is invisible? We're going to talk about a new counterintuitive approach to understanding, healing, and growing, so we don't continue to cycle back and forth between resenting our past and fearing our future. So stay tuned. My infertility journey ended in childlessness. I remember the anxiousness waiting for pregnancy test results. There were years of monitoring, blood tests, trigger shots to induce ovulation, ultrasounds, and countless fertility tests. Yet doctors could not figure out my fertility issues, stating that all tests came back normal. Doctors constantly assured me that I could conceive, and I clung to every ounce of hope for my miracle child to come. The inability to get pregnant was not a one-time grief. It was suffered with each negative pregnancy test, a repeated gut punch to an ever-increasing desperate hope. But after 2 decades of trying to conceive, no baby, no motherhood, for my own sanity, I accepted that my diagnosis was unexplained infertility. And then I realized that I had put my entire adulthood on hold for my desperate pursuit of motherhood. So I began grieving. I was grieving the loss of the children I had imagined. I was grieving a future that was not to be. I was grieving an invisible loss. It was a lonely process. There was no one I could talk to. At times, my mother and I shared our tears, but in the public space, I found it difficult to share my invisible loss and explain why I was grieving. So no one knew I was infertile. I did not elaborate after intrusive questions, since I felt like my infertility journey was such a private and intimate experience. I wasn't sure either if I was exaggerating my grief. I was never pregnant, never experienced a miscarriage or infant loss. I felt like people went through much worse experiences, so I persuaded myself that my loss didn't measure up against greater tragedies. Then I learned that infertility is a medical condition just as important as any other illness. The inability to have a child is a deep and profound loss, requiring the process of grieving every bit as much as the death of a loved one does. Infertility is traumatic, but if you've tried everything in coping with invisible loss and nothing has worked, perhaps it's time you try a different way. Firstly, you can remind yourself that you are no longer in the midst of the storm, and whatever hurt you in the past can no longer threaten you in the same way. And this is also important to remember. You cannot heal deep relational trauma of 10 to 20 plus years in a few minutes or hours. It takes micro steps. Invisible loss, whether failed fertility treatment, miscarriage, ectopic pregnancy, stillbirth, or the inability to conceive, is a profoundly sad experience. Grieving is the normal process of painfully releasing your connections to a loved one. But when it occurs before a life is fully lived or realized, you are grieving prospectively. That is, you are grieving the hope and dreams of what you believed was to come. Your dreams of the future and lost potential are not visible to others, so you may find yourself struggling with these intense feelings alone. And you may feel like your emotions are so out of sync with how the rest of the world is responding. That is, like you're feeling like you're overreacting while the rest of the world seems to underreact. Nonetheless, grieving must be done, and it's the tribute you give to the child you hope for. This is crucial in order to understand that childless women often feel silenced when others tend to presume grief entirely as tangible losses. The truth is, intangible psychological losses or invisible loss include changes in self-worth, changes in sense of control, changes in identity, or changes in worldview, all meanings for loss that involuntary childless women often experience or relate to. Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now we're going to move on and talk about how to grieve invisible loss. Now I'm going to touch on grieving an invisible loss and how to gain freedom from your invisible prison. We don't have many community rituals or ceremonies in place to acknowledge this type of loss. A ritual helps acknowledge your loss and can be an experience of support. A ritual helps continue the relationship with your unborn child and/or the child you imagined. Here are some possible rituals that you can do to cope with involuntary childlessness. Maybe some of these will resonate with you, but every person grieves differently, and what works for one may not be right for others. You can organize a ceremony or memorial service, which might be in your place of worship, in another place that's special to you, or at home. It can just be for close friends and family, or just you and your partner. Some examples include reading a poem or saying a prayer if you're religious, sharing stories about your pregnancy or the child you hope for, the dreams you had and the future you envision with this new life. Doing a naming ritual or blessing for the unborn baby. Doing a ritual symbolizing a letting go, like blowing bubbles, releasing a dove or balloons. And if you have a garden, planting flowers or a tree can be a meaningful way to honor your unborn baby or give shape to your grief. The flowers or fruits that grow on this tree can be a yearly reminder of the ongoing love that this life has given to you. If you don't have a garden, you can consider contacting a local garden for remembrance. Another idea is writing, which can be good to find words for your loss. We tend to make sense of our world through stories. So tell your story. You can start a blog or even write a memoir. Your story can serve as comfort and support to those experiencing the same thing. But you don't need to make your story open to the public. You can write your story just for a friend or therapist, or you can keep it in a special place or memory box. Also, creating a work of art can be very healing. Make, for example, a painting, a drawing, or a collage. Get your partner involved if he or she would like to. Don't worry about technique or being perfect. I hope you'll find comfort in some of these ritual ideas, because oftentimes our psyche wants to heal, and it will organically move towards health and wholeness if we stop getting in the way. Don't feel you have to perform a ritual or do anything at all. Maybe this is not the time. Rituals and memorial acts can be done later, even years after the loss. Everyone is different. There is no right or wrong. But a ritual can help make the invisible visible. This can help you acknowledge and validate your baby's existence or the child hoped for, thus giving you the right to grieve.
And now a quick break to hear from one of our sponsored affiliates, Booking.com, where our listeners can escape the city and spend your vacation or staycation at adults-only hotels and destinations. Along with Booking.com, we've curated adult-only outings just for you. If you're interested in booking an adults-only trip, whether afar or local, visit www.tutumglobal.com/travel for great deals right now.
Now we're going to move on and talk about healing invisible wounds of loss. Although the inability to conceive or sustain a pregnancy can seem socially invisible, there is no doubt that the grief is real. Grief is highly personal, and unfortunately, no established guidelines can speed you through this healing process. But there are a few steps childless women who are experiencing the emotional complications of infertility can take in order to cope and eventually thrive through this major life challenge. But you have to choose to want to heal. It is true that hopes are difficult to uproot. So in healing the invisible wounds of loss, the part of you that truly requires healing is the mind. Moving on means you've accepted your loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. You can move on with your life and keep the memory of your loss as an important part of you. In fact, as we move on through life, these memories can become more and more integral to defining the people we are. At its core, healing is a process of identity transformation, which means that there's no part of your life that won't be affected by this. No relationship that won't be affected, no ideas or beliefs about yourself, other people, or the world that won't come up for questioning. We tend to think that healing an invisible loss is about being sad, but it's far more profound than that. And once we've been through the depths of grief, we're not the same person as we were before. Pain changes you, and change hurts. But true healing is an intentional process, and your life is still your own to live with deep intention. But grief is a social emotion, and it needs the company of other people who you are interconnected with, who get it. Find your tribe, such as the Tutum Sisterhood Facebook group. Don't deny yourself the opportunity to connect with others. Also, allow yourself to be happy. It really is okay to be happy. Sometimes women feel it's a betrayal of their loss to be happy after infertility. You mistakenly believe that to enjoy your life without children implies you didn't want them as much as you did. But you can simultaneously enjoy your childless life and mourn the life you've imagined. Both can be true. Lastly, healing and contentment are both critical. It's the main way that we make meaning of the world and connect socially. And our meaning making and social connections play a huge role in determining our levels of happiness and peace. But in addition to healing, make sure to recognize and affirm, which is the wholeness, resilience, and resourcefulness that we already have, and which can continue to expand infinitely. Well, I hope this episode opened your eyes to know that just because your loss is intangible, you don't have to walk around carrying your grief like an invisible secret. By recognizing and affirming these feelings, make sure you realize that it's perfectly normal to feel sad and vulnerable. And that's when the healing process begins. So be gentle with yourself. And thank you for listening to I Can't Have Children, Now What? This podcast is about journeys resulting in childlessness. It's about thinking for yourself, but also thinking as a community, gathering knowledge from personal experiences, investigating infertility's medical mysteries from a woman's perspective, and the healing of women who are childless not by choice or by circumstance. Make sure to visit our website at ican'thavechildren.com, where you can subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you'll never miss a show. If you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Childless Women. If you have requested topics and questions, just let us know. From Tudum Global, I'm your host, Jobi Tyson.
You've just listened to the I Can't Have Children, Now What? Podcast with your host, Jobi Tyson. If you're enjoying our podcast, tell a friend, family member, or coworker about it. You can support this podcast and get exclusive bonus content, episode transcripts, polls, and more by becoming a monthly patron at ican'thavechildren.com. Thanks for listening.